is what's the first big historical event that you remember happening in your lifetime that kind of really opened your eyes to like, oh my gosh, like I'm not the center of the universe here. So what's something like that, a big kind of historical event that you remember?
Honestly, I remember I was sitting in the hallway at Pershing Elementary School in Springfield, and I was doing flashcards with one of my friends. We're just doing like 2 + 2 and 3 + 3. I was in 2nd grade, and the teacher like came out in the hallway and was like, "You guys need to come back in the classroom." And on the screen, the Challenger had just exploded. And so that was like my first, and I know I was only 2nd grade, but really that's the first time I really remember like, oh my goodness, here's a huge event. And I remember in school that year, we had all been following Krista McCullough and how she was going to be on that flight. She was going to be the first teacher to go into space, and how, I mean, we had been following that, and here it was, this huge tragedy. And so that's honestly probably the first time I can remember an event that, like, I guess kind of shocked the system or whatever and made me realize, there's bigger things than just me. So it was probably 2nd grade.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that your students have had anything like that?
Honestly, I don't really feel like they necessarily have, because
I'm
of course,
not sure.
Every year, we spend the day when it's September 11th, I spend the day trying to talk to them about it. And of course, when I get to September 11th with my classes, it's kind of different because I can actually tell them, I'm like, everything we've talked about so far this year, I've been a secondary source. I haven't been somebody who was actually there that experienced it. But now here's an event where I'm a primary source, even though I wasn't in New York City or Washington, D.C. when those things happened. I was still there and I remember that day going out in my front yard and looking up in the sky, and I could see Air Force One and a couple jets, and they were the only planes in the sky over my house. And that was just an eerie feeling, just looking up and seeing that. But, again, I feel like, I hope they don't have to go through an event like that to kind of make them recognize how important history is and how there's a bigger world than just them. I hope they don't have to experience something like 9/11. But yeah, I really don't feel like our younger generation today has really had an event like that has, been a moment where all the nation comes together and, recognizes one single event.
Yeah. I said something. I don't
know how you guys feel.
No,
I feel the same way. Like you would think COVID would have done it, but COVID really divided the nation more than bring us together.
I would guess, and that's actually a really good point. I would guess that in 10 years, if I ask my currently 11-year-old, if I ask him, hey, what's kind of the first big thing that you remember, the big historical event, or maybe in 20 years, right? Because that's, if he's anything like me, he won't start really being that in perspective until he's almost 30.
He's a little oblivious.
But COVID might be one of those things, the world pandemic, right? When everything shut down, and that might be the thing, right? That's actually a really good point, Jen. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, but honestly, we kind of guarded them from bigger. Because we saw the bigger picture living through it. That the world wasn't really, because when you've been through 9/11 and saw how we all came together, and to see something like COVID, we really didn't. And we guarded our children a little bit more, so maybe they felt like we did,
Yeah,
but
I don't know. I think that's a really good point. I'm surprised I hadn't thought about that earlier.
Well, then too, 9/11 was just such a bam moment, like it was just one boom, here it is. Whereas COVID was just kind of slowly. I realized we kind of saw it coming, then all of a sudden it's like shut down, but still it just kind of drug on. But I think you're right. I think probably for a lot of these kids, 10 years from now, this will be probably the COVID pandemic might be that event that they'll look at and recognize.
Pandemic,
yeah. And it's interesting, Jared, you said the shuttle, because that's mine too. The Challenger explosion is mine.
Yeah.
It's the first time, same thing. My school followed it. I went to school in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And so my school did the same thing, followed the whole thing. We watched it on TV, and it was the first time I was like, this is what's happening, right?
Do you remember talking to your parents about it or anything? Or did your family kind of discuss it? Or was it really more just hey, I was at school and this was just like a just complete shock. And I mean, you had some very specific details that you remember about that day. So obviously that's one of those things.
I more just remember that moment being in the hallway and having the teacher call us back into the room. I don't necessarily remember really discussing it that much with my parents or anything. So no, I guess I don't really have that memory, but I need to talk to I don't know if you're like me, your sibling seems to always remember everything better than you did,
yes,
when you were a kid.
That's very true. So I have one of those.
Call my brother.
You can remind me of things. So I'm like, oh yeah.
I tend to, my brother and I actually, we tend to remember a lot of the same stuff.
Yeah.
We're very similar in that regard. But the Challenger was not one for me. Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit younger, so I wasn't quite in school yet.
So what was yours then?
So for me, it was a local thing, and we'll get into that. Mm-hmm. But for me, it was a local thing, and so it was actually because I grew up in California, and so it was actually an earthquake. And it was a pretty good sized earthquake, and actually it was in 1989. Mm-hmm. And if you're a baseball fan at all, it was the World
San Francisco?
Series.
I'm sorry.
It was San Francisco's and the Giants and the A's when the earthquake happened during the World Series. Mm-hmm. I don't remember what game it was, but I lived close enough to the San Francisco area at the time that I actually felt it was either aftershocks or kind of the first wave. Yes. And both my brother and I, we were pretty young, and that's kind of the first thing that I remember. And we joke.
Oh, that story is so great. So Scott's a pastor's kid, right? His dad's a pastor. And they thought Jesus was coming back.
Yeah. Like, we had so much church and God in our house that we were playing basically like in a pool that had been filled in with sand because it was the 80s. And in the 80s, skateboarding became a thing, and the people weren't using their pools.
Because of drought.
And there actually used to be skaters. Like this is, just like you see in the old 80s and 90s movies. They would come and skate in the empty pool at my neighbor's yard and all that stuff. And so the neighbor moved in, and they didn't want that, and so they filled it in with sand. And so to me and my brother, we were like, great, this is our own private sandbox. And so we were playing in this pool filled with sand, and all of a sudden the earthquake starts coming, and I thought it was like, I was young enough, I thought it was just like a big truck or something driving by. We kind of lived near some farmland, but really what it was the earthquake, and the sand was hovering probably a good inch or two off the ground, and just everything was shaking. And so both my brother and I, we got up, we ran home, and it was either me and my brother were like, is Jesus coming? And, my mom just wanted to make sure that we're safe. Right. So we always laugh about that. So that's for me, that was the first time the first thing that I remember, and it was a little bit more regional. So that's a good segue into our next question is we like to ask some regional history questions.